Thank you, Colton. So we'll just let people trickle in as they have time to join us. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to FIRE 101 training. I'm going to cover some general housekeeping information first before we get started on the actual training. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and sign in at the back table. That way we make sure that you get credit for attending the training. For those of you online, we are able to see your names, but we weren't able to do the formal registration, so we're going to have some information for you at the end of the presentation as to how to let us know that you were in attendance this morning. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. We didn't have too many people in attendance yesterday, but if it gets to where we have one slide where we have too many questions, we'll just ask you to write them down, and then we'll address your question at the end of the presentation. We are going to have a list of frequently asked questions that we're going to provide at the end of the training. It'll be available on our SharePoint site, and we will send the link out with that information in probably about a week or two. Contingency plan for those that have issues with Zoom. Everybody online is using Zoom as the vehicle to attend if you aren't able to attend in person. We do recommend that you go ahead and pull up the PDF file of the presentation now. That way, in case in the middle of the training you have any issues, you can just open that PDF, access the presentation, and we'll make sure that we announce the slide number as well as the title as we go through the presentation. But once you have that up, then at least you can follow along if you get kicked off online.
And just an FYI for everybody on the phone, the slide numbers might be a little bit different for y'all following along on the PDF, so please follow along with the slide titles and we'll call those out.
There were some slight updates to the presentations after they were emailed out, so that's where you might see the variation, but we'll be sure to include the title as we move along. And again, all presentations will be available online at the SharePoint site. We'll send that link out. And there's also going to be a version of the training with an audio overlay so that you can access those at a later date for reference. We are going to prepare an audit preparation package for everyone. We have a lot going on this FIRE audit season, so those packages are going to include audit do's and don'ts, PM, RPM cheat sheets, a list of frequently asked questions, completeness talking points. We'll get into the completeness discussion in detail in 201, and you'll see that that document is really going to be helpful for the upcoming audit season. And there's going to be an administrative record guidance included as well, and we'll go into more detail about why you need access to that in 201. We want to make sure that you have everything that you need so you are properly prepared for this audit season, so that's why we went ahead and developed that package for you. But if at any time you determine, there's something else that you need or you have any suggestions, please let us know. Moving on to the training facilitator slide, slide 3. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Patty Reyes. I'm fairly new to CZRA. I'm the Restoration FIRE team lead, and I'm going to be replacing Karian. Yesterday, Karian was in attendance, so we were able to introduce him and have him give a wave to everybody. But Karian has taken a promotion with the environmental environmental compliance chief. So he's leaving us to go to JBSA, so we're going to be filling in for him. I started with CZRA back in July as a data analyst for the first 3 months, trying to fill in for a position in which we weren't going to have a fill coming in until October. So I worked as a data analyst for CZRO for approximately 3 months, and then I've been full-time on FIRE for about the past 4 months. So myself and Adam are fairly new to the program, but Karian's been really helpful in passing along a lot of information for us. I have approximately 10 years of auditing experience. I've done everything from ISO 9000 as an internal auditor. I've been on the other side of the fence as the one being audited in different types of audits. Initially in my career, it was in a pathology lab, so we had very rigorous, regular audits at least every 3 months or so. And then after that, when I relocated to San Antonio, I am a military spouse, so my husband received an assignment to as an MTI here at Lackland, so we had to relocate. And then I started doing ESOCAMP audits in 2013. So I've been auditing the government-owned contract-operated facilities such as Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, their environmental programs since 2013, up until 2019 when I took this position because it's a conflict of interest. I can no longer do that. But a cool fact is that being on those facilities, I was actually able to witness the assembly line for the F-35. So that was super cool. And those facilities are absolutely amazing and very pristine. So I look forward to working with everyone. And Adam and I kind of decided that we would alternate modules just to break things up. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Adam so he can introduce himself as well.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Adam Gonzalez. I'm one of the Restoration Fire Program Managers. I primarily have a construction and an estimating background. And so I've been with the program since about November, and I really appreciate y'all's participation this morning. We're going to go ahead and get started with Module 1 with Mrs. Reyes. Thank you.
So the curriculum for today, we're looking at the Fire Audit 101 curriculum slide, slide 4. Module 1 will include an introduction to fire. Module 2, Fire Audit Overview, what to expect during an audit in Module 3. The PM and RPM roles and responsibilities in Module 4. And then lastly, favorite part, we're going to have a quiz and do a recap and a wrap-up. Moving on to the learning objectives, slide 6. The purpose of the training today is to make sure that our fire stakeholders have all the information they need to understand the general overview of the fire program. And when I say fire stakeholders, I mean everybody that's in this room this morning is a fire stakeholder. We're talking the PMs, the RPMs, the PRD group, the data group, those in charge of sites, even our contract support that helps us out accomplishing all of our tasks every day. And we have somebody here from CZP this morning. So all of you are considered to be the fire stakeholder. We're going to have, this is the introductory general overview of fire, and then today from 1 to 3 p.m. we're going to have the deep dive with a lot more detail about the fire program. That's today from 1 to 3 p.m. So the learning objectives for today, we're going to discuss the history of fire, tell you about how fire got started and what fire looks like today. We're going to discuss the financial statement audit process. We're going to talk about how audits are conducted and how the Air Force statements are organized. We're going to discuss the 2017 FIRE guidance and review some key regulations and guidance and how the entities such as the Air Force report their financial statement to Congress. And of course, we're going to discuss your roles and responsibilities and how much you contribute to the fire process. Just to get an idea of who's in attendance today, how many of you are PMs? Okay, we've got about 4 PMs in the room. How many RPMs? No RPMs. I think we had about 2 or 3 yesterday. PRD group, I see in attendance this morning. You want to raise your hands? PRD? Are y'all asleep over there? Okay, data group. We've got some branch chiefs in attendance. Anybody else? We've got some PFOS, PFOA team members. Okay, so all of you make up the fire stakeholders that we mentioned earlier. So the goal of the fire training is to make sure that our stakeholders understand how they affect the Air Force financial statement, as well as the role that they play in the fire program. Moving on to the goals and history of fire, slide 7. The goal of the audit is to achieve an unmodified, clean opinion from the auditor. And the auditor evaluates our program by looking at our processes, our internal controls, our systems, and our data key supporting documents. But before we take a deep dive into the general overview, I want to talk a little bit about how FIRE got started. So in 1981, the OMB Circular A-123 defined the internal control program for all federal agencies. And then in 1990, the Chief Financial Officers Act of 1990 was signed into law by President Bush. And it's a federal law that was put in place to improve the government's financial management system. In 2005, the FIRE Directorate was established by the DoD Comptroller's Office. In 2014, the National Defense Authorization Act and the DoD were determined to have to assert audit readiness by September of 2017. In 2017, the DoD established the FIRE guidance, which was developed for DoD components, and it was determined that the Air Force needed to assert audit readiness. The Air Force is actually one of the last components within DoD to assert audit readiness. In 2018, the AERA program had its first observations by the auditor, and in 2019, we had our first full-scope financial audit. So this will actually be our second year. Moving on to slide 8. As we mentioned in the previous slide, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller's Office established the 2017 FIRE guidance. That's kind of our Bible that we refer to. So there's a six-step methodology that's in that guide that we're going to kind of glance over. They discuss discovery, corrective actions, validation, evaluation, assertion, audit, and sustainment. And we'll go into more detail about the actual audit process later on in the presentation. So fiscal year 19 versus fiscal year 20, slide 9. So what's actually happening in FIRE currently? In fiscal year 19, as I mentioned, we had our first full-scale audit of the AERA program. The IPA, which is the Independent Public Accountant, which is Ernst & Young, they're the ones who actually do the audit with us. And they found one finding for restoration, which we're going to discuss in detail later on in the presentation. What we expect for fiscal year 20 is that EY is going to have an increased emphasis and focus on the environmental and disposal liabilities. That's actually the line item in which restoration falls on the Air Force financial statement. So we'll get to know how the financial statements are structured later on in the training. The good news is that the auditor feels that ENDL could be one of the first assessable units to complete a successful audit. What we were told last year is that what we provided was really helpful in giving them the reassurance that we have a good, solid program. So what we were told is that this year they're going to be digging into the details. Once they feel really comfortable with our program, we should be fairly good to go. And we're one of the few accessible units that we're getting that type of feedback in regard from the auditor. So from what I understand, we look like we're in really good standing right now, but of course, it's not the time to relax and get comfortable. We got to make sure we still continue to do a good job moving forward. Environmental and disposal liabilities, slide 10. So there's 4 ENDL components involved with environmental and disposal liabilities. Restoration, other environmental liabilities, base realignment and closure, that's BRAC, and military equipment. So if, for instance, you see an ENDL finding, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually for restoration. It could be any one of these sub-AUs. The fiscal year 19 finding that I mentioned previously was issued to restoration and BRAC. So audit findings and CAP, slide 11. We received a finding for fiscal year 19 What the auditor noted was that we did not have a retrospective review process in place to compare our racer estimate with the contract actual cost. So, ironically, we had already identified this issue previously in a self-identified deficiency, and Carianne and Leanne worked together and had already developed the framework for the corrective action plan that was used when we received the NFR. So really, once we got the NFR, we were already anticipating it. The corrective action plan was already developed. So then we formed the corrective action plan working group, which was composed of the FIRE team, the key stakeholders, and PMs and RPMs. The FIRE team currently is composed of myself and Adam. Eventually, it will be composed of one permanent position and 4 overhire positions. So since the CAP was already previously developed, we just worked together as a team, made some tweaks, and finalized that, and we were able to submit that really quickly.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
How deep did they go into that finding? Were they just looking at dollar amounts, or did they actually go down and dig into the PCAD and the requirements? Because, I mean, there are some installations or RPMs and stuff like that come in and program requirements, build a wedge, try and build up a high project number, and then when it comes time to put that requirement on contract, the requirements may not necessarily reflect what was in the PCAD that was built.
Right.
So although you may have the dollar amounts equal, if you program this and buy that, did they get into the weeds on that and say, you know what you're actually programming and estimating is not what you're buying?
Right.
Did they get that deep in the weeds?
Leanne, would you like to address that? I actually wasn't here. I'm not familiar with exactly what they looked at.
Repeat the question to the folks on the phone, Patty.
Yes. We had a question in regard to the fact that what often happens is, I'm sorry?
Don't say RPM. Just
Oh, I didn't say RPM.
Are we buying what we programmed? I mean, that's the bottom line.
Yes.
Correct, and the finding was that we don't have a process
Right.
to check that.
Right.
So right off the bat, they didn't go into the weeds of contract and everything. They saw that we weren't even doing it.
Right.
So that is the finding which we have to correct now and build a process to actually do that.
Okay.
So those are the details that are going to be worked out by this working group to develop the process and look at what we need to look at. It may not even be feasible for us to do some of these retrospective reviews. But the fact that we weren't even doing it, we weren't even trying to do it, was what the finding was all about.
But, again, I would recommend that process include verifying that we bought the requirements we estimated, and if they change, right? Bottom line is, requirements change from one year to the next.
Right.
If you buy something different or slightly different, that we at least have a memo for the record on why what we bought differed from what we
Deviated so
programmed.
much, yes. Okay, understood, and we'll take that into consideration. Okay, moving on to fiscal year 19 Air Force audit findings, which is slide 12. This just gives you a look at what the auditor actually determined in their report in November as far as what was an issue for the Air Force. So every November, the auditor, after the audit is completed, they sum up all of their findings and produce a report for the Air Force. So this is some of what was mentioned in the report. So I'm not going to read all of them because that's a lot, but for example, lack of assessment, monitoring, and effective implementation of financial management regulation updates. They're saying there was a deficiency in the design and operation of information system controls, and then you'll see there on the bottom, that's in regard to our finding and BRAC's finding, insufficient support for estimates, including reconciliation of estimates to actuals. And again, they're discussing that there's a lack of a process there. So even though all these findings were listed in the Air Force report, we're not really sure if some other than the racer finding may have applied to restoration, but as far as we're aware of, it's only that lack of retrospective review that was an issue for restoration last fiscal year. So more information on that finding from fiscal year 19 and the CAP on slide 13. As I mentioned, it was restoration and BRAC that received the finding. This is the finding number right here, beginning with NFR and the actual title of the finding that was issued. It was issued in November of 2019, and as I said, luckily we already had something in place, so we were able to turn around that corrective action plan really quickly. The working group was established in November as soon as we received the NFR. And then we were able to submit that CAP for approval on January 8th, 2020. Implementation of the CAP is expected to begin in June, but we haven't received the formal approval from the deficiency remediation team just yet, so we're still awaiting that approval. We were given a heads up that what we were told is restoration kind of went above and beyond in the development of our CAP, because we went all the way down to the validation process, and then the fact that we would take a look at the process and make sure it didn't need to be tweaked, so ongoing improvement. So because the stats are reported at a higher level, they're hoping to get CAPs closed out a lot quicker. So what they asked is if we could just cut it down, and we're confirming this in our meeting on Friday, but basically just address the development and the beginning of the implementation and go ahead and get that wrapped up by the end of the fiscal year. So we believe that's what's going to happen, and then the rest of the portions we'll address later, but we're going to confirm all that in a meeting this week. So that was interesting to hear that we kind of had too much information in our CAP when we were trying to be very thorough. But it was, the estimated completion date was definitely, years down the road. So they just want to get something wrapped up a lot quicker. I want to stress that without the CAP working group, we wouldn't have been able to accomplish what we did. So it's really important, and the FIRE stakeholders play a key role in contributing to the work that we do in the FIRE program. So you all contribute your experience and your expertise, and we really can't be successful in this program without your involvement. Fiscal year 19 audit data, slide 14. This is a snapshot of what occurred last year. Last year, the audit sample requests didn't start until August 23rd and ended around approximately October 28th. So it was a really short period of time in which we turned around a large amount of information. The number of samples requested was 48. The number of items actually in each sample was approximately 44. So we turned over approximately 1,144 documents to the auditor. That is a lot of information to be pulled together in such a short time. And honestly, the people who carried the load for those requests were Faye and Laura, both here today. So we could not have done that without their participation. They really carried the brunt of the audit last year. The audit FIRE team just kind of helped facilitate all of that. This year we're expecting kind of a different approach, but we'll discuss that later on in the briefing as well. Number of follow-ups from the auditor, we had 56, and we have a couple of notations here on late samples and late follow-ups. 10 late samples, 24 late follow-ups, and then 16 rejections. So I just want to kind of touch up on those items a little bit to let you know what was going on in the background. In regard to late submissions, we had a lot of issues last year. It was the first full audit. We encountered network connectivity issues. At one point, I think Carion was unable to access the network for almost 2 weeks. The audit response tool is what is used by the auditor and us to get all the information exchanged. So the auditor submits a request in the audit response tool, it goes down to SAF, and then it comes to the FIRE team. Well, the ART tool crashed. So apparently, we determined that the ART tool has a limitation of approximately 5,000 documents. We submitted 1,044 alone. So you can imagine with all the other components and all the information that was requested, the database got overloaded and crashed. So what ended up happening is we had to come up with a contingency plan. So we started using email and DoD Safe to make sure that the requests and the submissions were exchanged. So getting all those details worked out, lots of time on the phone, lots of emails back and forth, there was a lot of delays there. And then you have to also consider the auditors from EY were fairly new, not familiar with our processes. We did hear back from somebody in attendance yesterday that when they were speaking with the auditor, there was a lot of comparison between the BRAC program and the restoration program. Well, the BRAC program is a lot smaller than our program, but yet they expected for basically us to have the same types of processes, not really realizing the magnitude of the size of our program. So you're kind of comparing apples to oranges. But so there was a learning curve there, not only for them, for us, for the FIAR team. Everybody was learning and trying to get acquainted with one another. So there was a lot of conversation as far as clarification. Okay, here's the request we received. What do you actually mean? What are you looking for? When we would submit, okay, this is what I'm looking at. Can you actually describe what's in this document? Because they weren't familiar with those documents either. So there was a lot of time spent on clarification. Rejections. What was happening when we talked with the auditor, we just had our kickoff meeting for fiscal year 19 on Monday. So in talking with them, what they said was there was a limitation with the ART tool. So when they looked at a submission and determined that they had some more questions and wanted some additional information to clarify, they rejected the initial submission and then had a follow-up after that. Well, in our minds, what a rejection constitutes is if you ask for A, B, and C, and we submit A and B, then that's grounds for rejection because we're missing part of the items that were requested. But in this case, we had A, B, and C, but it prompted more questioning, so they rejected that sample and then asked for a follow-up. Luckily, we determined this year they no longer have the rejection option. So we're pretty happy about that. So hopefully we won't see any rejections come through. But we did clarify with them, hey, we submitted what you wanted. We understand that it prompted more information, but we don't feel that that's necessarily grounds for a rejection. And they did confirm it wasn't that we didn't submit what was requested. It was that there was a limitation in the tool. They didn't know how to get that across in the ART, so they just rejected it and asked for a follow-up. So moving on, fiscal year 19 was very PRD data group centric. So like I said, pretty much Faye and Laura carried the brunt of the work last year. In fiscal year 20, we're expecting the auditors to take a look at the entire program. And we actually received a heads-up email yesterday where we've had about 4 submissions for requests already since the beginning of February. So we received our 4th heads-up email yesterday, and they did indicate that it is going to involve PMs and RPMs. So it's not just going to be PRD-centric this year. It is going to involve everybody in the restoration program, which is why we are so focused on making sure that you all have the information that you need to have a successful audit year. Okay, as I said, Adam and I are going to alternate modules, so I'm going to pass it on to Adam for Module 2.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Adam Gonzalez. I just want to reiterate to everybody in the auditorium and on the phone, if you have any questions during the presentation, please let me know. I really want to make sure that you understand the information. I'm going to give a brief overview of the FIAR audit. We're on slide Y, conduct an audit. So back in 1990, the CFO Act, the Chief Financial Officers Act, was signed and required that all federal agencies have to have audited financial statements. Now, there are 24 federal agencies, and 22 of them have already received a clean audit. We'll get into more detail about what specifically a clean audit is, but in simplest of terms, this is our goal. This is what the Department of Defense wants. We want a clean audit. That means that our financial statements are clean from adverse effects. And you'll notice here that the Department of Defense and the Department of Housing and Urban Development are the only two federal agencies that have not received a clean audit yet. So what this means is that Congress basically puts us under a microscope. Congress allocates billions and billions and billions of dollars to us, and we cannot assure them that our financial statements are free of fraud, waste, and abuse. So they want to, they're going to put us under more scrutiny. They want to make sure that when they allocate this money, it's being spent the way they want it to be spent, and that we can assure them it's free of fraud, waste, and abuse, and that our values are accurate. Moving on to the next slide, what is a financial audit? Financial audit is a systematic review and assessment of the systems and accounts. Now, what's really important about here is it's not just about the numbers. It's not just about the values on a spreadsheet. It's also a review and assessment of the systems. So they're going to review and assess our internal controls. They're going to review and assess our business practices and our methods, our processes. So why should you care? Well, again, the Department of Defense is only one of two last federal agencies that have not received a clean audit yet, and we are the last large federal agency to undergo a successful audit. So what this means is that Congress is noticing specifically our inability to declare audit readiness, and failure to produce a clean audit could mean increased oversight, scrutiny over programs, and major budget cuts. On to the next slide for audit purpose. So the main purpose of an audit is to ensure that our financial statements are reliable for decision makers. What that means is when leadership has a financial statement in hand, they want to be able to make sound judgments off of accurate information. So it would be no different than a general thinking he has an extra million soldiers in his ranks when he really doesn't. He's going to be making decisions that are going to be completely different. It's no different than somebody who has a financial statement in hand and they're trying to make decisions off of that financial statement. We want to make sure that those financial statements are presented fairly in all material respects. Now, the easiest way to explain material is to replace it with the word significant. So when you see material in the auditing world, replace it with the word significant. Essentially what they're trying to make sure is that when they see an issue on a financial statement, it won't materialize into something worse. So for example, if we have one transaction that's off by $1, that might not be very significant, but when you have 1 million transactions that are all off by $1, now you have $1 million problem. We also want to make sure that our financial statements are in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. This is also known as GAAP. You'll hear this a lot in the auditing world. These are standardized practices and standardized principles across the entire auditing industry in the United States. So it's not just public sector, it's also private sector as well. The next thing we want to accomplish with an audit is to report deficiencies in internal control. So deficiencies are going to be gaps or weaknesses either in our processes or on the financial statements. And we also want to provide an opinion on the effectiveness of internal controls. So what an opinion is essentially the grade that we get from an auditor. So rather than us being graded out of a 4.0 or 100, the auditor gives us a grade in terms of an opinion. And we'll get more into the different kinds of opinion types later. And we also want to report on non-compliance with laws and regulations. Now, why would an auditor care about our compliance with laws and regulations if they're mostly looking at our financial statements? Well, if we're not complying with all of laws and regulations, then our estimates could be understated if we're not accounting for all costs and all methods for laws and regulations, as well as additional internal controls that might be required by such. Moving on to the how a financial audit works. So the Financial Audit Manual, also known as the FAM, lays out 5 phases. Now, 4 of these phases are conducted by the auditor, and the 5th phase will be conducted by us being AFCAC. The 4 phases are the planning phase, the internal control phase, the testing, and reporting phase. So during the planning phase, the auditor will perform a walkthrough to understand our business processes, our controls, and our systems. Now, when you see the word walkthrough, you might think that that is a physical, in-person walkthrough by the auditor. It's not necessarily the case. It could be a virtual walkthrough. It could be an observation through a telecon, for example. And the big point here is that they're not just looking at our numbers on a statement or our numbers in spreadsheets. They are assessing our business processes, our controls, and our systems. It's kind of important to understand that these auditors are not environmental auditors. They're just auditors. So they don't understand environmental, and they might not understand all of our lingo. So they want to understand how Air Force and AFCEC and restoration specifically conducts their business so they can better assess how we do things. Next phase is the internal control phase, where the auditor will assess internal controls and determine risk levels. And when you see internal controls, this can mean a lot of things. For example, your CAT card is an example of an internal control to safeguard assets to make sure that unauthorized people don't have access to certain things. Another example of internal control could be increased oversight by requiring a supervisor's signature on a form. And we'll get more into internal control types and different examples. The third phase is the testing phase, where the auditor will perform an analytical procedures to test account balances. So part of what they'll do is they will follow a transaction from its origin all the way to when it gets to a financial statement, so a cradle to grave approach. They're seeing how that value matures, how that value changes, all the hands that it passes through, and all the processes and internal controls that value goes through. And once that value then gets to the financial statement, they're trying to see if that value is credible, if it's justified, and it should be there. The last stage is the reporting stage, where the auditor will provide a report on its audit procedures, its results from testing, and its conclusions. On to the next slide for financial statement overview. On the right, you will see a snapshot of a consolidated balance sheet. A couple of things to note here. At the top is the section for assets, and at the bottom is the section for liabilities. Now, this is Air Force's consolidated balance sheet. So we're down here at the bottom for ENDL, highlighted here, with a value of about $13.5 billion. Now, this balance sheet is going to include all assets and liabilities that exist as of the financial reporting date, which is 30 September. So way down here at the bottom, we have this $13.5 billion. The auditor is going to look at this entire consolidated balance sheet, but then they want to dive into each one of these numbers and go to each one of these balance sheets as well. So when we go to the next slide, which is the ENDL financial statement, you'll notice the total at the bottom is also the $13.5 billion that was on the previous sheet. So each value on that consolidated balance sheet, the auditor is going to keep backtracking those values to see how we got to those numbers. So this is ENDL's financial statement. At the top, it's called a Note 12. Sometimes it's called a Note 10. Sometimes it's called a Note 14. It changes year to year sometimes. You'll notice that ENDL accounts for approximately 39% of all Air Force liabilities. So ENDL is a huge portion of all of Air Force's liabilities. Since this presentation is more focused towards restoration, we're going to focus on those values. Restoration is $7.7 billion of these liabilities, which is about 57% of all ENDL. Moving on to the next slide for Module 3 for Mrs. Reyes to take over.
So Adam told you a little bit about the financial statement and what that looks like. So now we're going to talk about what to expect during the audit. The audit process life cycle on slide 23. So this gives you a visual of what an audit actually looks like. Adam mentioned that it starts with the walkthroughs and the site visits, and those aren't necessarily face-to-face. They could be via telecon. Those are actually coordinated with staff and the FIR team. Currently, I guess there was some issues with coordination last year, so this year they've come up with a site visit tool, and we're going to be using that. The site visit list for fiscal year 19 was supposed to be distributed on the 7th, so we should be hearing something soon in regard to which of our sites should anticipate a visit. And as soon as we get that information, of course, we're going to get it to all of those that are involved. But so we should have a heads up prior to them coming to visit the installation. So if we are notified that an installation is going to have a visit from the auditor or a call from the auditor, we'll be sure to notify the ISS as well as the RPM via email. If it's a PM, we will make sure that your branch chief is notified as well as the PM themselves. Oops. Next phase is the observations. In 2018, the auditors came and did an observation of the ERA program to get acquainted with our processes. And then this year, the auditors have actually asked if they can sit in on some of our PRD meetings. So we actually have certain PRD meetings selected in the month of February, and they're going to be sitting in on those meetings as well. What they're trying to get a gist of is the type of information that's exchanged, the conversation that takes place during those meetings. That way they have a good understanding of our PRD process and those table meetings. SIDs and NFRs, we've kind of talked about those already. We did have a SID developed, self-identified deficiency for the retrospective review process, and of course we discussed the fact that we did receive a notice of finding and recommendation for the fiscal year 19. And then the last part of the process is the corrective action plan. We're going to take more of a deep dive into that process in 201, but this gives you an idea of what's involved during that process. We confirmed that we received the NFR. We plan how we're going to address the deficiency. We design how we're going to develop our milestones, the tasks that are involved with addressing the deficiency, and then the implementation of the deficiency, and then the validation. So in regard to site visits, slide 24, the sites are chosen by the independent public accountants. So they, as I said previously, they're going to provide us with a list, and then we're going to let you know if your installation is involved with one of those site visits. So everyone should be prepared at any time to have a visit from the auditor, which is why we're making sure that we have these trainings. We're making sure that you have an audit preparation package with all the documents that we feel you need so that you can be prepared for a site visit. We want to make sure that you have everything that you need to be successful. If at any time you determine, after reviewing everything that we've provided for you, that you need some additional guidance or assistance, please be sure to reach out to us. We will have a list of the POCs at the end of the presentation. We just want to make sure that you're equipped and ready. So helpful reminders. If you remember anything in this class, this is what I stressed to everybody yesterday. You don't ever want to give the auditor more information than what is asked. If they ask for A, you give them A. You don't want to, this is not the time to tell the auditor everything that you know about the subject, not the time to shine in front of the auditor and let them know how smart you are, not the time to let the auditor know about all the deficiencies and the issues that you think need to be addressed in your program. No. We only want to let the auditor know what they asked for. That's it. Because when we open that door, then we've opened the door for all the other questions to come through, and we don't really want to do that. We want to let them do their process, ask their questions, get them their answers. And not that we don't like the auditors, but, it's not the ideal situation. An audit sometimes can be a complicated situation and make some people uncomfortable in some situations. So, not the time, just remember. And the one thing that we want to remember?
Give them A if they ask for A.
Right, you never want to offer more than what was asked of you. And we're going to give you a list of do's and don'ts for those site visits in that audit preparation package. Okay, here's a list or a glance at what we're expecting for fiscal year 20. This is actually the auditor's process. So currently, they're in their planning phase. The planning phase includes that kickoff meeting that just took place on Monday. They're clarifying questions right now, trying to get acquainted with our processes. They've already asked for the PRD guide. They've already asked for the process cycle memo. So they're taking a look at all that right now so they can be ready to do their testing and evaluation of our internal controls. So next phase is the internal control process. And that's to make sure that they assess the effectiveness of our internal controls, make sure that we are doing what we say we are doing, and that we're in compliance with all laws and regulations, as Adam mentioned previously. During the testing portion, that's when they're actually gonna start requesting those, key supporting documents. So if, for instance, with the example that Adam provided, they wanna follow a project from cradle to grave, that's the time in which they're gonna, be looking at that information, when they're actually doing the testing. And then in November, they will provide us with a report for the Air Force on what they actually found during their audit. And they'll issue an audit opinion, and we'll actually go into a lot more detail on the types of audit opinions and the audit opinion that we received in 201 this afternoon. So the types of audit requests that come through, the provided by client is one of the requests. That's a living request list developed by the auditor and maintained throughout the audit. The sample request is a specific document related to the PBC list. So the big difference between these two is turnaround, and we're going to show you that in the next slide. And then, as I mentioned previously, there's also a follow-up. If they feel that once they looked at the initial request, they have a couple more questions, then they're going to issue a follow-up on the initial request. So here's the timeline as far as how much time we have to get these turned around. The PBC has 5 business days to respond to the request. It's the start of a new fiscal year. We're already kind of having issues with what the 5 days constitutes. Previously, once it was issued into the ART tool, the clock started. We received a formal request. We had 5 days to turn that around. And so, of course, it took a day to get all the information, a couple of days, 1 day to get it out to you all. You all gathered the information, got it back to us, and we make sure we got everything turned around in 5 days. What they're doing right now is they're kind of providing us with a heads-up email. Hey, we're going to have some requests that are coming through. These are what they look like and what's involved. It's not formally submitted in the ART tool yet, but right now there's some question as to whether that 5-day clock is starting when they give us the heads-up or when it's actually formally submitted into the ART tool. So those are some things that we're going to be clarifying in the next few days. The sample requests, we have 10 days to respond to those, because generally those are those deeper dives with a collection of, for one sample, for instance, it involves a collection of 44 documents. So we have more time to get those requests addressed. And then the follow-up is the quickest one. That's only a 3-day turnaround. Usually, in our minds, a follow-up would just be some sort of clarification, but surprisingly, sometimes those follow-ups, again, involve gathering one file with 44 documents again. So, I mean, we have to move really quickly sometimes, and depending on when they're going to determine when the clock starts and when it ends, we may only have 1 day and a full 24 hours to get that information out. So, we have to make sure that the process that we have in place is very efficient. Everybody is reached in a timely manner. All the information is submitted just as quickly as possible. So this is a look at the flow of requests for fiscal year 19. EY, which is the auditor, would send the request to staff via the audit response tool. Then it would go to the FIR team, and we would grab it out of the audit response tool and forward it on to the party who actually has the information that's needed. Last year, that was PRD and data group. Like I said, it appeared to be a PRD data group-centric audit last year. So, and then they provide us with the information on the share drive. They go ahead and drop the information on the share drive, and then we pull that information and upload it into the ART tool and submit it to the auditor. Here's a snapshot of how things may flow for fiscal year 20. Basically the same situation, except we don't expect that it's going to be PRD data group centric. So now we're going to involve the FIRE stakeholder. So we may have to send the email to the branch chief or the ISS, make sure we CC the PM and the RPM. Have to work with them to get that information received, probably via email or DoD safe, depending on the size of the documents that are being requested. And then again, the FIRE team will take a look at that information, make sure everything looks good, and then submit it to the ART for submission to the auditor. These are the types of documents requested in fiscal year 19, slide 30. They took a look at the PCADs, BSISs, HCOTs, the RODs, cost to complete, evidence of meetings. So really, this is what they looked at last year, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what they're going to look at this year. Anything is up for grabs, and there's really no way for us to anticipate what they might request. But we might have a little bit of an idea. So anticipated document requests, slide 31. We're anticipating they're going to take a look at the audit files, review all those memorandum for records, those documents, and completion appears to be one of those things, or completeness is one of those things that they seem to be interested in this year. We're going to go into a deep dive on that in 201, but completeness can also be referred to as our site universe, our site inventory. So we're going to make sure that you're familiar with all those terms and those processes and how to get the auditor the information that they need for the upcoming fiscal year.
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
Going back on those documents.
Yes, sir.
The assumption is that the PMs aren't providing the majority of that stuff, but that's all part of the PRD process, and that should be in the file, right?
Yes.
They're not providing, that's all stuff that's already,
Right, and
the data group provided that.
exactly. So we tend to just reach out to PRD, they get us the information, and then so we don't actually have to involve the PM or the RPM. Last year, we did have an example in which PRD was unavailable, so we had to reach out to the PM and the RPM in that instance. Go ahead, Max.
Could you repeat that for the folks on the phone?
Yes, he wanted to know how the requests actually go through. If it's a document for something in the audit file, we don't have to necessarily ping the PM or the RPM. We go ahead and work with the PRD group because they're the ones that have access to the file, so we don't have to involve the PM or the RPM. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take a quick break at this point. What time is it now, Adam? Return time? It's 10:01, so you want to return at 10:10?
I'd say 10:06 probably.
Okay, 10:06. 5-minute break. That's precise, isn't it, Tim?
So starting on Module 4, want to talk about all these stakeholders' roles and responsibilities. Next slide for roles and responsibilities. I understand not everybody in this room is a PM or RPM, but because y'all are such key contributors, I want to focus specifically on some of y'all's roles and responsibilities. First thing to note is that y'all are key contributors when it comes to the site ID and the site closure process, as well as the PRD process, and that these processes help validate the values that are reported in the financial statements, and they include the cost estimates for the valid environmental liabilities. Additionally, I really want to hit home that audit success requires strong teamwork, coordination, and transparency throughout the process. Now, part of what I mean by transparency is also honesty. We don't want to lie to the auditor. We want to make sure that our responses to the auditor are clear. Now, we don't necessarily want to answer more than what is being asked, but if an auditor is specifically asking about something that you think or know might have a mistake in it, we don't want to mislead them or lie to them. On the next slide for PM and RPM's impact on financial statements. When it comes to steps 1 and 5 here for site identification and site closure, these are really, really important for a variety of reasons. One reason is that the auditor doesn't just care about the total number or the total value on a financial statement. They also want to make sure that those values are allocated correctly, i.e. that money isn't just the right value, it's the right color as well. So when it comes to the site identification process, we need to make sure that we're categorizing our projects correctly. For example, categorizing between IRP and MMRP sites. And when it comes to site closure, this is extremely important, especially this year. The auditor is going to be focusing on our inventory and making sure that our site inventory is correct. If we are showing and documenting that we have 100 sites, then reality also needs to show 100 sites. We can't have 99, we can't have 101. What's in reality and what exists in our documentation has to match. For steps 2 and 3, the program requirements development process as well as the program adjustment process. These are huge when it comes to PMs and RPMs input and impact. The cleanup costs related to site inventory are configured by the PMs and RPMs, and this directly has an impact on the financial statements. So while the PMs and RPMs aren't the ones compiling the financial report or specifically dealing with the financial report itself, you're definitely having a direct impact on the values that are on that financial report. Moving on to the next slide for auditing do's and don'ts. These really apply to everybody. The first thing is to be professional, cooperative, honest, and consistent. As I said earlier, honesty is extremely important. We don't want to lie or mislead the auditor. And consistency is very important. We have a lot of PMs, RPMs stretching through a lot of bases across the U.S. So when we have 10 PMs who are doing the same process, all 10 of those PMs for a similar site need to be doing that process consistently. Otherwise, it's going to raise a red flag to the auditor. We all need to prepare by familiarizing ourselves with the audit process. This is extremely important so you know what you need to do when it comes to auditing. For example, it's important that you know that as a PM or RPM, you are not supposed to directly talk to the auditor. There might have been some instances last year where some people thought that they were supposed to directly give an answer to the auditor. It's important you understand the auditing process for things like that. We want all responses to go through the FIR team for a variety of reasons, but one of those is that way we can help QA, QC those responses, and so that way we can facilitate that those responses get to the right people. We also want to provide documentation within the specified time frame. So as it was stated earlier, we only have 5 days for a PBC data request. Now that's not 5 days for me and then 5 days for you, that's 5 days for the entire team. So when a data request has to pass through 5 hands, it could be that you only have 24 or 48 hours to provide something to us. What else is really important here is that people understand the primary and alternate POCs for those data requests. For example, if we send out a data request to somebody on a Friday and they're on RDO on that Friday, then we're losing that 24 hours if somebody didn't see it. So everyone needs to understand who the primary and alternate POCs are for getting that data, and the data needs to be readily accessible, so it's not just accessible by you, but it's accessible by somebody else in case you're out on leave or out on training seminars, etc. Additionally, please notify FIR if any request cannot be met and the reasons why. So we don't want to just go back to the auditor and say, yeah, we're not providing this document to you. We want to have a valid reason for why we're not providing the document to them. So this could be for a multitude of reasons. One of them is that the documents could just not be ready yet. If the auditor is asking for a document in June, but the document won't be ready until October, then we can't provide that to them. Another reason is we might not be obligated to provide a certain document to the auditor. So there are documents in the audit file. If there are documents outside of that audit file that the auditor is asking for, we are not necessarily obligated to provide those documents to them. We also want to know where key documents are located and the associated key stakeholders and systems. So as I said earlier, we don't have a lot of time to respond to document requests. So if somebody is out on leave or on RDO, we want to make sure that those documents are readily accessible by somebody else. Also, we want to respond to all questions in writing. There's a lot of reasons here why we want this. The first thing is that Patty and myself, we are FIR employees. We're not PMs and RPMs, so we don't know how to do your job as well as you do. So when the auditor is asking for a PM or an RPM's insight on something, we don't want to get a verbal response from the PM or RPM and then lose some things in translation when we provide that to the auditor. We don't want to misrepresent y'all's information, so we would like all questions to be answered in writing. That also helps us QA, QC those responses before we get them to the auditor. We also want to clearly label the supporting documentation and highlight and mark the requested transaction information. Now, what's important here is it's not just for the auditor, it's also for the FIR team as well. If the auditor is asking for information that's inside of a 40-page document, we don't have a lot of time to QA, QC those responses. So if there are instances where there's only one piece in that document that we need information from, if you could just let us know this is the information you're looking for, and mark any additional clarifications in case that information on that document isn't clear. As I said earlier, the auditors are not environmental auditors. They don't understand environmental language. They don't understand the lingo. So they might see a number on a document and not understand why it's labeled the way that it is, and they could be requesting that value or that number or that question in different verbiage than what we usually have. So that might require additional clarification for them. Also, we want to focus on following the established AFCAC response protocol. Again, please don't respond to the auditor directly. Those responses need to go through the FIR team. let's talk about some don'ts. First, don't offer subjective theories or opinions. One, we don't want to confuse the auditor. It's far better to say that you don't know if you don't know. That's fine. There's no good reason to provide subjective opinions or theories. The next is don't submit documentation or respond to the auditors before fully understanding the question being asked. Again, the auditors, they don't understand environmental as well as we do. So they might ask things in certain language that might sound confusing to us. So please ask for further clarification if you need it. We also don't want to provide unrequested information for a multitude of reasons, as Patty was saying earlier. Please only answer A if they're asking for A and don't provide additional information. We also don't want to spring surprises on the auditor. If the auditor is asking specifically about something and we know that there's a mistake in there, we don't want to spring surprises on them. We don't want to mislead them in any way or lie to them. Also, don't provide any personally identifiable information under any circumstance. Again, the auditor doesn't necessarily understand all of our forms, all of our documents, and they might not fully understand all the information that might be in a 40-page document. So if you know that there's any PII information in that document and the auditor is requesting it, do not provide it under any circumstance. We also don't want to review documentation the day it's due back to the auditors. Most of the time, we can access that information by only going through a few hands, but if you wait until the last moment to look at that document, you might realize that you don't actually have access to all the information. You might actually have to reach out to somebody else. So we really appreciate everybody providing timely responses and getting to those as soon as you can. Don't give false data. Again, it's far better to say that you don't know if you don't know. Don't volunteer information, as we said earlier, and don't mislead the auditor. Moving on to Module 5 with Mrs. Reyes.
Okay, favorite part, quiz time. Okay, recap of Audit 101, slide 39. We're going to go over a couple of questions here. True or false? When responding to an audit question, oops, hold on, I missed a slide there, sorry. Okay, recap of Audit 101, slide 39. So, just to recap everything, audits are complex. They do take the teamwork. Every FIR stakeholder plays a key role in the audit process. We're required to coordinate and provide transparency to the auditor. So why should we care about FIR? Because if we fail to have a successful audit, we can have increased oversight, scrutiny of programs, and possible budget cuts. We definitely don't want any of that to happen. As I said, it's not that we don't like the auditors, but definitely rather they wrap things up quicker than stick around a lot longer. So don't want to have increased scrutiny over our programs. Okay, so review of the questions. Question number 1, true or false? When responding to an audit question, it is best practice to call the auditor directly and provide the information. False, correct. Okay, moving on to question number 2. How long is the response window for a document PBC request? Correct. Question number 3. What does it mean for financial statements to be presented fairly and in all material respects? I'll give you a couple minutes to read all those. How many votes for A? B? Any takers for B? Any takers for C? Any takers for D? Anyone? Okay. Answer is C. The level of error is below the threshold that significantly and adversely impacts the financial statement. So that actually concludes our Training 101. You all did an exceptional job on the quiz. Here's the information for the POCs, myself, Adam. As I said, we are expecting in the end to have a team of 5. We're just waiting for their arrival anxiously. We have created the CZR Fire Workflow inbox. Highly suggest that if you need to reach out to us, you always CC that box. I would suggest also that you print out this slide and kind of have it taped up in your cube. But CC us because I have RDOs, we may be on vacation. When you're dealing with those really quick turnarounds for follow-ups, you got 24 hours, you want to make sure you hit up the workflow box in case one of us isn't around, somebody else on the fire team can pick up the ball and run with it. We're going to provide everybody with a training certificate, slide 45. To receive your training certificate, for those that are in the room, you signed in so we know who you are. For those of you online, we weren't able to actually do a registration. We have an idea of who's present online, but just to confirm, if you could send an email to Colton Richardson and Adam Gonzalez as well to make sure that you get that certificate, we'd appreciate it. You should have the certificate within the next week or two.
And for those on the phone, if you plan on taking 201 this afternoon, wait until after you take 201 and send us that email, and just let us know that you were also in attendance in 101 as well.
If you attended both trainings, yes. All right, thank you everyone for coming out. At the end of the presentation that's going to be on the SharePoint site, there's an appendix as well with some acronyms and explanations there. Thank you so much for your time and attendance.
Hey, I have one question.